Welcome to ACME Shed. This is a 3-part mini-series on making a 5/8 5 TPI right hand unipass tandem ACME tap to cut a new bronze nut for the saddle lead screw on my Herbert Junior Surface Grinder Mark II. Now, why is it in 3 parts? And each part, by the way, will be about half an hour. Well, because I've never made a tap before, let alone a tandem unipass ACME tap, and so there was a lot for me to learn. And every step in these videos was doing something important for me to build up my skills and learn the setups to make this tap work. And there were struggles at times, but everything you'll see contributed to the successful outcome. Now, I started with about 2.5 hours of video. I mean, it took me days and days to do this thing, and I managed to cut it down to about 1 hour and 45 minutes, and I'm trying to make each part about half an hour. I'll do a quick close-in shot so you can see what I've made. I'm doing this not as a spoiler, of course, but to prove to you that it's worth watching the video. Now, in the first part, we make a prototype tap in Delrin. In the second part, we work on the silver steel to cut the threads and cut the flutes. And in the third part, we're essentially doing all the things we need to do to cut the nut, the bronze nut, which in itself was quite a challenge. I watched one of the big famous channels recently, and I'm not going to say which one, but a guy had basically made one of these in about 5 clips. Well, that's not real life to me. Not where I live. And the second thing is another famous channel. I'm not going to say who that is. Bought a couple of these and broke both. And it cost him, I think it was $195 US per tap. And he broke them both. Now, not through no criticism implied, but with a lot of care, I got away with it. Anyway, enough of introduction. I'll just give you a quick close-up of these before we start, and then we'll let it roll, okay? So there's the tap, and there's the new nut, and there's no play on that. Very pleased with it, but my goodness, it was a struggle. It's almost time to put the saddle on, but before we do that, we need to make a new nut for the saddle screw. I've shown you this before. Bronze nut, 2 inches long. I think it's about 0.23 inches in diameter, so a bit under 1 inch, but bigger than 7/8. The screw's quite soft, but it seems to be okay. It's not worn really, as far as I can tell. And we've got a couple of options, but what we can't do, or at least I can't do, is to use a boring bar to cut that thread on the lathe, because it's only about 11 millimeters in diameter. And so my boring bar, it's a big heavy thread, my boring bar would twist and bend, and I just know it's not going to work. So I need to make a tap. So there's a few options for making a tap. Now, somebody suggested, and I think it was a great idea, to use an existing tap and recut it. Now, that is 3/4 Whitworth left hand, which I bought for £1 at the Auto Jumble. Now, if I look at the core depth of that thread, I could machine that clean, just about, and cut the thread on that. Obviously, I'd have to soften it and then harden and temper it again afterwards. And I think that's an option, but I'm probably not going to do that. And also, Kim Bozelic pointed out to me on eBay, US eBay, there's a 5/8 by 5 TPI tap, and I think it would be about $44 US. Now, looking at the company, I'll show you the picture in a second, but looking at the company, they're in China, and I think they'll ship to the UK, even though it was only on eBay US. I couldn't find it on eBay UK. Hopefully you can see that. So it's a fairly long tap, but you'd be using a single tap, a single taper, let me say that, to cut quite a deep thread. I'm sure it would work, and I've got that as a backstop really, because I think they would ship to the UK. But what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to make a tap out of this piece of 5/8 silver steel. Now this is the very first time I've made a tap of any kind, so this is, as usual, quite experimental. I'll show you the type of tap that I'm going to make. Try and make. I'm going to try and make what's called a tandem unipass tap. Okay, now I found that on eBay US. I can't see anything in the UK. That happens to be a 3/4 6 TPI, so no good for this job. I should say, by the way, that this thread is right hand, and that is $120 US plus $23 postage. Fairly typical if you're buying from the US from here. So that's what I'm going to try. Now I've thought about this so many different ways, and it was very difficult to find the kind of entry point to this. So do you know what? I'm just going to do something. And I'll just learn by experience what works and what doesn't work. But the first thing I'm going to do is to try and cut the tap in this piece of Delrin. And the first operation is going to be machining this down to 5/8. And I'm going to do that whilst I've got the fast speed on the gearbox on the lathe. When I say fast speed, I mean so I can do a fine cut is what I mean. And then we'll need to set up the lathe for 5 TPI. Now it's a metric lathe, so I'm going to need the magic 63 tooth gear, which I've got. And one thing I've realised is just how much pressure these fast threads, like 5 TPI, put onto the lathe gearbox gear ring. So I'm going to have to make sure I get everything nice and tight, because I've had that slip in the past. Oh, but hold on, I forgot to say, to try and get me to the right depth of thread, I've bought some of these thread gauge wires, whatever they're called, and those were only £10 I think delivered. Now I'm not so concerned about the measurement exactly. What I'm concerned about is to get it to match this, if you understand my point, right? So what I've done is put 3 wires into these threads and put the gauge across it, and I know that measurement. So as I'm working, I'll be using this as a guide. So I want to tap the same size as this, but with enough clearance so that when I put the female part on it, it's not binding. This is the time to make all the mistakes. So that hopefully I get it right when I'm working on the final piece. I'm just taking this down to 5/8. I had to take this down to 10.3 to be able to slide that nut onto it. Maybe 10.4 would have been okay, but 10.5 was too tight. And we need this to clear because that's going to be where the square will be. Well, after a bit of trial and error thinking, here's the plan. So we've got about 7 inches to play with. So these add up to 6 7/8. We've already cut this to 10.3mm diameter for 1 1/4. I reckon I could get away with a 3/8 square. I think this is the finished threaded dimension, so I think 1 1/4 long with a taper of 1 3/4 for the roughing out part of the thread on the tap, 1 inch, and then a taper of 1 3/4. Now working out the angle here, so 1 3/4 is 44.45. I'm sorry, I just keep flipping between imperial and metric, but that's how my brain works. And with a bit of maths, we can see that that opposite to that angle is 2.775. So inverse sine of that over that, I reckon, is 3.6 degrees on there. Now I am concerned, this is, like I said, 10.3. This will end up as 10.3 here. I'm going to keep it on the rest of the bar, because when it comes to cutting flutes and cutting squares, I think I'll need it on the bar. Now it's only soft, of course, being Delrin, and as we cut these really deep threads, it might easily wind off here or here. But you know, that's why we do practice, make our mistakes on this hopefully. So that's the plan anyway. Just to highlight another design consideration, that distance between there and there needs to be at least 2 inches. And as it turns out, it's just about to scale, look. And that's so that we can get all the way through this new nut, well, it will be new, without interfering with the tap wrench. Now, if I had a problem, I could tap it from the other end, couldn't I? You know, go in from the other end. So maybe not quite so critical as I'm saying, but let's design for that anyway. I'm just setting up my tooling and I've got a problem because the insert doesn't sit correctly in the holder. So you can see the shim. Now I don't know if you can tell, but that hole doesn't line up in the centre of the shim. And it's even worse with the insert. So as I put the screw in, it's having to pull the insert hard to the right. And also the insert doesn't really come forward enough. You see, it's set back. So I'm going to have to machine this holder so that the insert sits properly and aligns with that hole properly. You might have seen my review of this Vivo tilting table. Now honestly, this is the very first milling job I've done since I got that table. And guess what? I need the table. Now I've set this up by eye. I can only tilt in one direction. I can't tilt the other way. So I've had to pack it out with a piece of wire and try and get it as close as I can. I'm not aiming to mill out the entire pocket. I'm just going to take a fraction off this edge here, the edge of the pocket at this side. So my aim is to get the insert to travel more to this right side and also slightly more to the front if I can. I may have to machine this back edge of the pocket, I don't know. We'll just have to see. But luckily the shim has got beveled edges, so that helps me a little bit because I may not have to get right into the very corner. Just warming up to start with. I haven't used this machine for ages and it's quite cold in here. Well, it's still not perfect. The problem is the screw is out of line, or the pocket is out of line, one or the other, because this screw is still slightly too far this way relative to this, and you can sense that it's the way it tightens. Anyway, I've taken some off this here. I should set up and take some off the back, but I'm not going to do it. It's just too awkward to do. But what I will do is take a bit off here, because this sticks out too far. When this is cutting a thread to the right depth, you can tell from that point there, it's pretty much in line with this, and I think that by the time you get to here, this will be touching the work. So whilst I've got the angle set up, I'm just going to take a bit off here. I've just used this 20mm cutter to take 1/2 mil off the front of the tool here at the same angle, just down to this level. Maybe a shot from this angle is better. You know, this tilting table is proving to be quite useful. First job for the grinder to act as a table. Let's see what we've got. So, okay, that looks reasonable. I can get that insert pretty much to the bottom of that thread without fouling that edge now. The question is, how far does the insert need to go in? Now when I measure the thread depth, well, when I think about it, it's 5 TPI, so that's a pitch of 0.2 inches, and if it's basically a square thread form, even though it's ACME, it should have a depth of half the pitch, so 0.1 of an inch. So if I just try this round end wire on these calipers into here, check the depth of that thread, and then I measure that, just trust me, I've measured it, onto this, and it comes out up as 0.104 inches. So that looks right. So when I try this against here, you maybe can't see very well, but yeah, it looks right. All I want to say is it looks right. I'm putting some strips of carbide paper under these jaws because this stuff is inclined to slip, and we'll be doing heavy cuts, and we've had it before where it's slipped within the jaws doing deep threads. Now this might knock it slightly off centre, but I don't think it matters. You know, this chuck is terrible for flash rust. It's not as bad as it looks actually. I usually spray it with WD-40 when I know there's a warm front coming in. I did this off camera so that I could concentrate, but I still made a couple of mistakes. I started to cut this taper a bit too early back here, but I changed the taper angle to 4 degrees because I didn't really want it quite as long. Also, I reduced this diameter in the rough cut section of the tap. I shouldn't have done that yet. Next time with the silver steel I'll do it when I've finished cutting the threads, because I've got this travelling steady set to this size, but now I've reduced it, it's not going to support it fully. Anyway, that's what prototypes are all about. I've got the lathe set up for 5 TPI, I'll show you the gearing in a second, and I've started to cut this. Now I'm going straight in. A few reasons for that. One is, if I move this top slide right over here, this fouls with the dial on the cross slide, so that's a bit of an annoyance. The other thing is, what I want to do is when I finish cutting the teeth, I want to widen these teeth here again to give the rough cut rather than the finished sizing. And really, to do that, I'm just going to add a bit to this top slide, and for that I really do want this angle and not back here at 14.5 degrees off 90. So for 5 TPI on this Harrison 140, 50, 63, 80, 120, and this plunger in the 4th hole along, coming this way. And I've checked it, of course, and it is 5 TPI. And I made a mistake once that I didn't get that banjo plate tight enough, so it really has to be clamped tightly, because what happened that time was, under the strain of it all, this plate moved down, disengaged these gears, and obviously it was no longer indexed and it ruined the thread. But not this time, that was on a previous occasion when I was making the mill nut. And the problem really was I was taking cuts which were far too heavy. So, you know, all that experience is in the bank now. Well, it's the usual cycle. It's a metric lathe, I'm cutting imperial threads, I can't disengage the half nuts. So I've got to make my cut, bring the tool out, reverse the lathe, repeat. Now I'm making 0.1 of a millimetre cuts on this, which is 4 thou. The thread depth is 0.1 of an inch. So if you work that out, that's going to be 25 cuts. When I come to cut the silver steel, I think I'll be making 2 thou cuts, so that's going to be 50 cuts. Now that's a lot of opportunities to make a mistake. So because the half nuts are engaged, as soon as I touch this, it's going to set off. Except, reverse the lathe. See what I mean? How many opportunities are there to make a mistake? Now it should just start cutting this narrower section. Okay, tool out. So I've zeroed my dial, reverse, and it's quite useful to have this really long plain shank here. It gives me quite a big safety zone. Now whether that gives me problems later, you know, when I come to cut the square and cut the flutes, I have no idea. We'll just see, won't we? Stop, put into forward, add the cut, 0.7 I think now. Now I really should get a notepad and start writing this down because I'll lose track. Check, check, yes, go. I mean, it fair zooms along, doesn't it? You can see that lift on it. It's not going to cut that very well, and that's because I'd reduced this part before I should have done. Never mind, it's only the prototype. So you can see I've cut the threads on this section here fully with a thread depth of 2.6 millimeters, which is just over 0.1 of an inch. But as soon as I got to this part here, it started to deflect. So this travelling steady was doing a really good job of holding this in place. And for similar reasons, I just didn't bother at all down here. It was just moving too much. So I think that's taught me that when I come to put the threads on the silver steel, I'm going to put all the threads on first, have this travelling steady, and then I'm going to taper it later. Now I've tried this nut on here, and it screws on easily till about there, but then it gets tight. Well, that makes sense because this was deflecting once it got past this parallel part, and these threads won't be so deep. I mean, obviously this is a bit worn anyway, but it's going on there very nicely. Oh, these gloves again, look. I tried the black ones. I got a size too small. They keep splitting. Yeah, that's looking good. As another check, I'm going to measure with the thread gauge wires. Now I drew this in Visio and I copied out the thread form. Now in Visio, if you expand this enormously, you can get your drawing extremely accurate. So this is all to scale, and these wires, 0.107, well actually in the kit it's 0.108, described as 0.108. When I actually measured it, it was 0.107. And as I put these in and measure across the three wires, I get 0.677. And when I tried it on the physical screw, I got 0.675. So look, the error between the two is incredibly small. So, you know, a lot of people rubbish Visio and say it's not a proper tool, but I find it enormously useful. So we'll put 3 of those wires in to that thread I've just cut, and we'll just measure across and see where we are. Next day, and I've been giving this a bit more thought. Sometimes it's useful to think about things overnight. So using 1 wire, because I really couldn't balance 3 wires on here, and also I couldn't get my gauge onto the end here because of this sticky out part. So just using 1 wire, and then comparing with the measurement on this with 1 wire, I found that there's about an 11th thou difference, or about 1/4 millimeter difference between the thread depth on this and the thread depth on this. Now another method I tried, because I wasn't happy with that one, I tried using this little pin here that comes out of the bottom of these calipers, which is quite useful actually, and going this way like that and measuring that, and by that calculation, comparing this against this screw, I reckon the difference is about 1/8 thou. So this, on the face of it, needs to be cut 1/8 thou deeper. But what's really hard to get my mind round is, of course, I'm not cutting a screw, I'm cutting a tap. And what I cut on here will end up, the negative of it will end up in this, well, the replacement this. And that's difficult. Now I already know that the outside diameter of this is 0.6275. So that's actually 2.5 thou bigger than standard 5/8. Now my silver steel is standard 5/8. So I may end up having to trim this slightly, because these crests are likely to bind once the tap has cut the hole in the replacement this. And it's hard to forecast or understand the effects of cutting this deeper, because I'm going to have to leave some clear tolerance. Now, I've made a decision about the order for this, the order of sequencing. I'm actually going to make it the other way around. So this part will be to my left when I use the silver steel, and these tapers will blend down this way. And the reason I'm going to do that is I want to be able to do some test cuts. So when I'm working in silver steel, I'll put a piece of Delrin on from this end. At that point, I won't have reduced this diameter to make it like the first cut. I'll leave it as finished cut, and then I'll try the Delrin on, cut, try that onto this, and by that method I'll be doing the fitting of it. I daren't just go straight for the tap and cut the bronze. I just don't trust myself to get that right. Now it brings us back to this. So when I put this on here, excuse me, it's about freezing in here today, so gloves on again. That's a lovely fit on there, but I don't want that because we know that's really slack. And again, that was another indicator that I hadn't cut enough thread depth yet. So I'm going to cut another, probably 0.1 of a mil. Does that make sense? I think it does. Or it might be half that. I've got to think about that. No, I've got to cut it probably another 0.1 of a mil. And then that should be slack on there. And then I know I'm about right. Yeah, does it make sense? I hope so. It's confusing. Whoa, should have stopped. I was looking at the camera instead of looking at the lathe. Never mind. It's just the prototype. We've survived. So after that cut, try this on. I can just feel a little bit of slop in it, which is what we want. Maybe I could cut it slightly deeper, but I can use this nut as a gauge when I'm cutting the silver steel, and when I start to feel the slop in this nut, I'll judge whether I've gone far enough. Yeah. Okay, so now this can come out and we'll try putting some flutes in it. I want to find a way to set up this chuck from the lathe on the mill to index to cut the flutes. Why do I want to do that? Well, although I've taken this piece out of here and lost the registration for cutting threads, I might not want to do that with the silver steel workpiece. So if I cut the threads on the lathe, get them to where I think they should be, transfer this to the mill to cut the flutes, leaving this work in, untouched, unmoved, cut the flutes, then try my Delrin test piece. If I find that I need to cut just a little bit more off the teeth, cut them a bit more, I can mount this back on the lathe. If I'm careful, I won't have lost registration on the work. You see what I mean? Now, luckily, I think the centre height of this is a little bit higher than this chuck. You can see that comes to more than halfway across here. And so, if I set this up to just free rotate with this indexing pin here, and I can do that by rotating this to take it out of gear. So if it's this way, the worm is engaged. If it's this way, this is free to rotate. Now that's different from what I said when I reviewed this, because I said that this was for adjusting the engagement of the scroll, but it's not. Well, the worm anyway. In fact, that's over here. I just didn't know at the time. I thought I was right, and obviously I wasn't. Just tramming this to be horizontal. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. Maybe 1/100th of 1 millimeter dip. Yeah, dip towards the front. That's pretty good. Now I'm going to move on and measure this. Now you can see I've put some packing spacers in here. They're just aluminium strips. just to cover these threads, partly to protect the threads, but partly because of the way the jaws are shaped with sort of teeth on them. They weren't settling very well on these threads on the back of the chuck there. Well, we're getting there, but there's a lot more work to do yet. I haven't trammed this yet, all this to be correct this way like this. I've got the tram blocks for these, but I haven't cut them yet so that it'll fit within these T-slots. So that's to do. Also, adjusting the height of this, not done. Got it approximately right. I'll probably have to take this off, put the Morse taper 2 center in there, get the points together with this. Maybe put a test bar in it, clock it along the top, something like that. This can tilt, so it can do this and this. I'd like to say that was a feature, but I think it's just an accident of the design. So I need a clock across the top of there as well. So still quite a lot to do. But you can see that this round nose cutter gets right across here, no problem. I've worked out that I need to leave at least 15 millimeters stick out from the jaw here to give us enough room to do that. And then if I just lower this a bit, we can get right across this and cut those flutes. No problem. I'll show you on the big tap how it cuts right down. This cutaway here is right down below this diameter. So the logic is, and you can see the sense of it, to clear the bottom of these threads here, the flute has to cut into this. I mean, that's the benefit, I guess, of having a two-stage tap. And the first stage, hopefully, won't put as much strain on, and then the second stage again, compared with having a single tap. But with all this work involved, you can see how a 35-pound tap from the States, actually from China, begins to look attractive. Because if you were paying for this by the hour, it would be darned expensive. Shall we put some flutes on this prototype piece then? I'm cutting most of the depth of the flute, but not all the way, just on this first cut. Well, more lessons, obviously. Of course, it can do this as well. I'm just going to cut this section here. Well, doing that, I've learned a few things, which leads me to more work. I tried to use this rounded end mill cutter to cut this, because I wanted to try that cut on some steel. And yes, it starts to cut, but it tries to push the work out of the way like that. Now, whether that's because this isn't sharp enough, it's not super sharp, to be honest, but then again, it's got no cutting edge really at the bottom. So I've come to the conclusion that for that to work, I've got to cut a trough first, and then use that to shape it. But it's asking too much to get it to cut this very center there. It doesn't seem to work that way. Now, I did think about setting up the horizontal mill, because you wouldn't get the sideways pushing action if we were milling across here like this. But I don't have any male rounded cutters. What do you call it? Whichever way it is. Convex cutters. And I looked for some, and they were so expensive, so we can forget that. So I thought, well, whilst I've got this, having to tear this down, I'll just check that this is right. Now, I don't know if you'll be able to see this. It's really asking too much, isn't it? Where are we? There you go. Oh, it does work, look. Now, I don't know what you can see, but I think that's lined up. If you don't agree, keep it to yourself. But it's taken ages to get this level because there's no, it's just free in space until you clamp these up. It really could do with some set screws in here of some kind so that you're jacking up on some kind of block underneath. Now the advantage of this is it can go at loads of different angles. Look at my glove again. What is it with gloves? I mean, I don't know, you know, they all go like that in no time. So anyway, now I've got this set correctly. I mean, if I was super, you know, worried, I'd have to set up a test bar between here and I'd have to clock it. But honestly, it's taken me so long to get that close. I don't really want to do that.